Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be looking at the King's Indian defense, which starts out with pawn 2d4, knight f6, pawn c4, pawn g6, and a lot of people refer to this as the King's Indian defense, but most of the variations except for one, which we'll get on to at the very end, are actually going to have the same moves here, and so we're going to refer to this right here as the King's Indian defense. And we can actually go a step farther with pawn to d6 here. As you can see, this is what a lot of other people refer to as the King's Indian defense. And what you can see here is black is really looking to have a very solid kingside defense. He's going to castle on the king side, and he's very strong, but as you can see, none of his pieces or pawns have moved past the 6th rank. And because of this, this is a very passive defense for black. What he looks to do is control the center with his minor pieces, and then later on, once he has a strong defense around his king, then he's going to try for counterplay with his pawns. He's going to start pushing the pawns up, either with e to e5. A lot of times you may see pawn to c5 or pawn to b5, but we'll get into that depending on the variation. What I do want to let you know is if you're a very aggressive player, you don't want to play this as black, because pretty much throughout the entire game, as we'll look at different variations, we're basically responding to what white does. So there's not a lot of times that we can push the action and be in the driver's seat. Most of the time we're responding to what white does. Now we have a lot of options depending on what white plays, but more or less depending on what white does, we have to respond to that and not the other way around. So just want to let you know that this is a very, very good defense, and it has a very strong win and tie rate for black, but I do want to let you know it's not very aggressive. So we'll go ahead and start getting into some of the variations that you may see in the King's Indian defense. Let's go ahead and take a look at the first variation, and you'll see this a lot from players from white that tend to favor their bishops. They really want to get their bishops involved, so they bring them out early. And this is the Bach variation. It starts out with bishop to e2. Very logical move. This is a very important piece for white, and since he can't bring it to c4, which a lot of players like to do to attack the f7 square because his pawn's here, a lot of times you'll see him bring it to e2. And so from here, like in most of the variations, we're going to castle on the king side, and we have a very solid defense around our king here. And then a lot of times we're just going to respond to what white does. And in this variation, white's going to bring his bishop to g5. Again, this is someone that really likes to play with his bishops very early on in the game. He likes to get them involved early and puts a lot of pressure on black. Now from here, black has a few options, but more or less black would really like to counterattack on the queen side, and this happens a lot in the King's Indian defense. He builds up a very strong defense around his king, and then he wants to push on the queen side. So a lot of times from here you'll see black push with c5, and this is going to put a lot of pressure on white, but white really doesn't want to give up the control that he has on the center, so more times than not you're going to see white continue to push forward with pawn to d5. Now if he wants to exchange, that's completely fine with us. That's what we want him to do. We want to, since we have a strong defense around our king, we want him to start giving up control of the center. But if you're playing someone who's very familiar with the King's Indian defense from white, and if you're playing it yourself, more or less you just want to bring your pawn to d5. It really allows you to still have central control, but at the same time not give up any counterplay from black. So from here, we're going to get our knight involved, and it's very important to know where you want to bring your knight. We want to bring our knight to a6 so that we can bring our knight to c7, and then we can start to push pawns and our pieces forward so that we can try to counterattack on this b5 square. But also keep in mind, if we bring our knight to d7 here, then bringing it to b6, this really isn't going to do much for us. We can no longer push our pawn forward. Our bishop here really can't get into the action on the queen side, and it's really blocking off our pawn advancement. So just keep in mind when you are playing, especially in this variation, that you know exactly where you're putting your knight. So in this case, we're going to bring our knight to a6, and then next logical move from white is to develop his knight to f3. Nice development move, at the same time getting ready to castle on the king side for king side safety. And now we're going to bring our knight to c7 as we talked about. And then we have a few different moves. We can first bring our pawn to a6 to put a little bit more defense on this pawn that's coming up to b5. Then we can also bring our rook to b8. putting also a lot more pressure on the b5 pawn once we push forward. So this is the Bach variation. So let's go ahead and look at a few more variations that you will see in the King's Indian defense. The next variation that we are going to look at is the classical defense that you may see quite often. Instead of a player bringing his bishops into the action, he's first going to bring his knights into the action with knight to f3. This is a very logical move, especially for someone as white that's not too familiar with the King's Indian defense and is just logically developing his pieces. So the first move is knight to f3, and black again is going to castle on the king side, and now white is going to now bring his bishop to e2. He's not getting quite all of his pieces involved as far as his bishops, but he doesn't want to bring his bishop out, his light square bishop, so that he can castle on the king's side. From here, we're going to start to push up with our pawn. We're going to bring our pawn to e5. We're going to start to attack the center control that white has here. And from here, white's going to castle on the king's side. And then black, now as you can look, this is a little bit very different variation that we talked about before. But since we have our pawn on e5 instead of our pawn on c5, we can now bring our knight to c6, and now we're really trying to attack the center control. Before, in the last variation, we were completely looking at the queen side, but in this variation we're actually looking at the central control before we start to counterattack anywhere. And so that's why in this case you want to bring your knight to c6, so we can add more pressure, add defense to this e5 pawn at the same time attacking this d4 pawn. So this is the classical variation that you will see. A lot of times from here white's going to attack the queen side, and a lot of times from here black may transfer his knight. He may bring his knight to e7, and then he may start to attack on the king side. It really depends on what white does. If he tries to bring his pawn down to d5, then from here we're going to bring our knight down to e7. Then we're going to start to counterattack on the king side. So just very important to know where your knights are and where they're going to go. So if you retreat, you don't want to retreat back to b8, and you don't want to retreat back to a5. Once he comes down to d5, then you want to start looking at the king side attack. So very important to note that. So that's the classical variation. Let's look at a few more. The next variation is the psalmist variation, and it's pawn to f3. And as you can see here, this is a very aggressive opening from white. And what you can usually tell from this is white's looking to castle on the queen side, and we, of course, our next move is castle on the king side. Anytime both sides are going to castle on opposite sides, it's usually a race to the king. So we're going to be completely focused on attacking on the queen side, and more or less he's going to be attacking on the king side. So what this means is it's going to be a very sharp and aggressive play from both sides. So once you see this, you definitely want to build up. Obviously you're going to castle on the king side. You want to have very strong defenses here, and then get ready to aim at the queen side over here, because he's really going to look to castle on the queen side and attack you on the king side. So from here there are a lot of different variations. I did want to touch on one variation that you may not see very often. If the bishop comes to e3, again, if he does castle on the queen side, he's going to look to get his dark square bishop and his queen out. So a lot of times you will see this dark square bishop come to e3. Then we're going to bring our pawn to c5. Now this, you don't have to play this, but this is a very strong gambit, so I did want to go over it. As you can see here, we are going to lose material, but once he takes our pawn and we retake, I'm just going to go ahead and through the exchanges, he's going to take our queen, we take, and once he takes our bishop, we're going to bring our knight to c6. Nice development move. At the same time, we need to defend this pawn on e7. But as you can see here, we have control of this d file, and we're putting pressure on this d4 square, which can come down the road very important to black. At the same time, we have more pieces developed, and at the same time we have a very, very safe king, and white does not have a very safe king. He can obviously look to castle on the queen side once he clogs up this d file, but as you can see from this gambit, we've given up a pawn, but at the same time we've kind of made it very aggressive for black. So if you ever do come across this variation and you want to take it into an aggressive route, I definitely recommend this gambit. So this is the psalmist variation. Let's get into. Looks like we have time for one more variation. Now, I do want to talk about the V and Quetta variation because you will see it a lot in top play. And it's a little bit different. It starts with knight to f3, and both sides are going to fianchetto on the king side. As you can see here, I'm just going to go through the moves. And then we're going to bring our pawn to d6, very common. But as you can see here, both sides have a very strong defended king side. But at the same time, white has a very strong central control with his pawns on d4 and c4. So a lot of times from here, black's going to bring his knight to d7. If he does ever want to push forward with his pawn to e5 or c5, it's very important to have his knight on d7 to help him out, because really black has to play passive early on and then try to counter these two pawns that white has here. So these are the variations that you will see in the King's Indian defense. If you haven't already, please subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.